premise for this book that you have wrote, The Stone Tablets of Mu?
Well, my first book, you mentioned it, Lifting the Veil on the Lost Continent of Mu, Motherland of Men, was a culmination of research that I had engaged because from an early age I've taken the view, and my family has passed down the view, that my great-grandfathers were all a bunch of hooey. And his theories are that there was a Pacific Ocean continent which was actually the Garden of Eden, and then the people from there went around the world to colonize, and that is essentially where our civilization has come from, and eventually the island sunk. And the current work that I'm here to talk about is the Stone Tablets of Mu, and it was it actually is wrapped around, like my previous book was wrapped around the Lost Continent of Mu, Motherland of Men. This book is wrapped around a completely unknown and unseen book for the past 80 years, the copies of stone tablets found by William Niven in Santiago Ahuizacla near Mexico City.
Thank you for the pronunciation, Jack. It's a tough one, isn't it?
I've had a little practice. And so James took this and presented it to his publisher, and it has remained in the University of California, Berkeley, I believe, library in a special collection, and it hasn't been seen. And I was lucky enough to obtain a copy of a PDF copy, and from there I wanted to make it available so that everybody could see it. And essentially the book covers the stone tablets specifically, the 38 or so that are contained in James' work. Mm. But there were in total some 2,600 of these tablets, and James used quite a few of them in his subsequent works.
Mm-hmm. Just to focus on James for a second and tie it in with your own engineering, you come from a generation of engineers, and James himself was an engineer. He was a patented inventor, an engineer, and an expert fisherman as well. And he even had a patent for an armored plated steel that was for protect ships during World War I. So this guy was no fool, Jack. This guy was a pretty clever guy.
Absolutely. He also had patents on railroad ties and different things for railroads as well.
Was he respected in his day for the work he was doing?
I would have to say no.
Did anybody get
circles,
it? Did anybody get it, Jack? Did anybody get it, or was it largely shunned?
Well, there were people that got it and have continued on with his thinking. The major part of being that, the major part of which is not whether or not there's lost continents, but whether or not we can bring ourselves back to a period where we all got along and didn't fight. Mm. You know, we were better people, I think, back then. Mm. Or at least that's the thing I get from James' thought. Sure. And his works.
Sure. Yeah. I actually lived where he was born in Okehampton in Devon. I lived all around Cornwall and Devon in the UK, and Okehampton was one of the places I lived in. It's a lovely part of the world. So James basically came from Britain to America, and started a family there, and,
actually he, departed England, after he got married in 1871, I believe, or 1870, and they moved to his wife's tea plantations in Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it was called at the time. Mm. And he was a tea planter in Sri Lanka. And that's what I have evidence for.
Sure. He had a connection with people in Sri Lanka as well, with the Tales of Mu.
Well, he did include one giant plate in one of his books that came from Ceylon, as he called it, and I believe it shows the image of the Naga with several heads, though, so more like a hydra. But I believe that's what he calls the sign of the Creator.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Tell us about William Niven, where he fits into this grand scheme of things then.
Well, William Niven was absolutely a hard-working man. He came over here from Scotland, and within a few years, within a very short period of time, found himself in New Mexico mining. Eventually, he became a commissioner of mining for a county in Nevada, and attended an exposition where he represented them, and he also took along his collection, and he went to an exposition in New Orleans, I believe, and eventually moved up to he went into business with the man from the Petrified Forest, and who had all those rocks. So they took all these rocks together and opened a storefront in New York. And he found out from there that perhaps his partner found out that they weren't very interested in buying a whole bunch of fossilized wood, so he kind of got out of it, and Mr. Niven kept the store open, and he was actually kept in business from going around to all the different sites and picking up gems and whatnot. So he stayed in business there until he was sent by an agent of Thomas Edison to go to Texas and find something called gallulite that he wanted to use, that Thomas Edison wanted to use for filaments. And eventually he was picked up to go to, then he went to Mexico and met the governor of Mexico, the governor of the state of Guerrero in Mexico. And he had a spectacular collection of ruins that he had been digging from just a short ways away, and that the governor did, and showed Mr. Niven. And I believe this is around 1894. And on the way back, Niven decided to go through these ruins. And he spent several weeks, I guess, digging, and I guess that's when you could say he probably caught the archaeology bug. But eventually he was working on other projects, silver mining and other ores, and eventually he moved to Mexico City and set up a storefront there when he was selling some of the things that he was finding. The farmers from the local area that had been digging in the clay pits and in their fields brought to him artifacts, and he'd buy them. And as mentioned in his biography, he one day just said, "Well, I'll pay you twice as much if you just tell me where you're getting this stuff." And so he took it upon himself to go out and start doing surveys after getting some information, and eventually he started excavations on Saturday and Sunday afternoons that he would direct. And beginning in 1921, that began in 1911. But in 1921, he found the first of the 2,600 tablets. And through about 1925, he kept unearthing them.
Wow. Mr. Niven, William Niven, sounds like a smart cookie as well. I mean, he'd found a lot of ores, and he even has one named after him, Nivenite.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So we have two intellectual guys discovering tablets, philosophizing about their actual interpretation. This stuff has been lost for about 80 years, really. In terms of, it hasn't been lost. I mean, the information has just been largely ignored, Jack. Do you think the time's right for this stuff to come out?
I believe that, for me, yes. I mean, I believe that, people should be able to read this and understand what he wrote, and also read some of the background that I put into here. I've also included several of James' other papers on the colonization of Central America and his version of their history. I think it's important that people find out what they wrote.
Let's get into these Naacal tablets. These, they are controversial, but setting that aside, let's get into some of let's give the listeners a description of these Naacal tablets, what they are, what they're made out of, their size, the symbology, some of the art. Give us an explanation in a layman's sense.
Okay, well, the Naacal tablets, as it were, James wrote that he discovered them in India. and that he had befriended a rishi of a local temple and engaged in their study for a considerable amount of time. And eventually the rishi started to translate the tablets for him, and he says that they're copies of the original tablets from Mu. They had 7 rishi cities, I guess, in each of the colonies, where they would bring in one major set and make all these copies. And James said that there were other copies available, and he mentioned a Tibetan monastery, although I haven't found any evidence that it really exists. But the connection with Niven's tablets that he discovered in Mexico City is that,
Niven's tablets are very, very similar in nature to the Naacal tablets then?
That's what James wrote.
Right.
James wrote that these tablets were another one of the tablets from the rishi cities, or it was a rishi city, and here were all the tablets, and he interpreted them as such.
So James and Niven, were they in contact with each other? Were they doing separate work independently and then got together, or
yes?
What's the deal between? Were they separated first and then became aware of each other?
Well, James included an entire chapter in the 1926 Lost Continent of Mu, Motherland of Men, called Niven's Mexican Tablets, or I believe that's the title, and which is the entire chapter is also included in this book, because it obviously has relevance.
Where's Niven's tablets at today? Do we know where they're located?
Actually, some of them are in museums, and some of them are. The story in Niven's biography is that he had this storefront, and in the book you can see pictures of some of his the shelves lined with the tablets, and he would be selling these in his Mexico City storefront. But when it got time to move back to Texas, he had them all carefully wrapped up and boxed, and unfortunately the Mexican authorities didn't give him the authority to move them out of the country. And so the biography says that they buried them in a Veracruz yard, in somebody's yard in Veracruz.
Wow. Wow, so they're still waiting there, ready to be unearthed. Maybe.
Because a very unique letter I found a few years ago from Howard Carasey, which was James' nephew, and received all the rights to the books and his estate when he passed. And an official from the Mexican government actually wrote him a letter and was very, very interested and quite impatient concerning where Niven's finds might be today. And even, I believe, had him come and visit the Mexican consulate in New York.
Wow.
To grill him on the subject. So I don't know if perhaps somebody has found them or gone looking for them or what the thing is, but maybe in the near future they'll be unearthed. And but that's one reason why I started a new repository of all the Niven tablets that I have access to.
Sure.
To show on online so that people can look at them, and eventually maybe the interest in the tablets will arise, and somebody will fund an expedition to find them.
Where can we get that website? Can we got a web link for that you can read out for us, John?
Yes, it's nivtab.my-mu.com.
Wow.
nivtab.my-mu.com.
Beautiful. I'm going to have to troll through that. I guess some of them may have been sold to private collections before they packed up and went and got buried.
That's correct.
A few maybe loose ones and twos may have been sold off.
Well, I'm not sure. Then there are also some supposed to be in Harvard.
Wow.
At least that's what I read.
Sure. Well, having the online gallery or collection it would be a great idea to spark interest and rediscovery of the tablets, I guess. Tell me again about now the Naacal tablets that James Churchward was involved with. They've totally disappeared as well.
Yes, and James is the only person to have ever said that he's seen them, so that's all I can say.
Do we know
the
location?
One of his,
that was in India. They were located from India.
That's what he said.
I believe the Niven tablets are a lot of people, and I looking at some of the rubbings as well, that they are associated with Scandinavian petroglyphs.
There is, because I can't remember the gentleman's name right offhand, but he did write a book and saw the article that Niven, one of the first articles that Niven wrote, and it contained tablet number 1389. And he said that it was something about the sun and the movement, and that's also mentioned in that biography, Buried Cities, Forgotten Gods. It's about William Niven.
In your opinion, then, what do you think is the most significant or dominating aspect of the Niven or the Naacal tablets, from symbology or descriptions, or when you're looking at the imagery and what we have that's left of the tablets, the rubbings? What do you think is the most important thing there?
Well, some of them are bizarre, to say the least, and I'm not sure how I would. Maybe I haven't seen enough of them, but I don't know how I would interpret them. James obviously knew, or thought he knew, how to interpret them, but I'm sure that there's other people out there who might know different interpretations, who might see something completely different in it, maybe even an academic or two that would be willing to lend his talent to look at them and decipher where and what they are.
Not for the listeners, but more for you. On page 27, you've got the Niven tablet number 386. Incredibly like megalithic rock art in the British Isles. Incredibly like rock art. I mean, it's significant of petroglyphs we have here. So, and there's the spirals too, but that one specific, it looks almost like a 4-leaf clover with zigzags inside it.
Which page?
It's page 27, the Niven tablet 386 at the top. Incredibly like megalithic rock art.
Well, that one specific one is one of the. James says it's one of the 4 symbols of the 4 sacred powers, and the 4 sacred symbols. On the other hand, Mr. Cornyn, an archaeologist who also examined the tablets, thought that perhaps that tablet looked more like a flower that was a symbol of a particular deity.
Sure. Yeah, that's what I think it looks like in the megalithic symbols, by the way. It looks like each flower or petal is like a teardrop type shape, like that of a daisy or something like that, but like a four leaves. Certainly looks to be highly symbolic of something, I would say at least. Do you think that these tablets then, let's hypothesize that we have a lost continent of Mu, which I think is a lot of people distinguish between that and Atlantis, but for the lost continent of Mu, that these guys were, recording on tablets, then, some symbology or scientific nature or philosophies on these tablets. These were like scraps of what was left of their history. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, James wrote that the Naacal tablets were actually made out of clay, and the tablets that Mr. Niven found were all very, very strong stone.
Andesite. I think it was andesite I read that one of the Niven tablets was
Yes.
made of, which is really, from an engineering perspective, we both know, Jack, but for the listeners, andesite's incredibly hard to carve. Incredibly hard.
So there had to be a meaning. I mean, they had a strong will and necessity to carve these crazy designs in there. And so what does it mean?
Of course, Niven's tablets being andesite, he would have recognized the quality of that, being a mineralogist.
Well, they were also colored, too.
Wow. Yeah, because you can get green andesite and grey, I think. There's different colors.
Well, he said that, no, that the carvings were actually filled in.
Oh, wow.
With colors. Wow. And some of those are included in James' remarks in the portion of his book in here. He doesn't mention color in any of his other books, so I'm not sure what the meaning is, or if it has any meaning.
What in any way do you think is the symbology? Can we extrapolate a definite, other than the idea of a lost continent? Do you think there's anything to say where the lost continent was? Is there anything that links Niven's tablets with James's tablets, the Naacal tablets?
Well, James obviously thought that he could interpret them the same as the Naacal tablets.
Which implies then tablets in India and tablets in Mexico being very, very far away from each other, having a common source. Is that the hypothesis for the Mu continent?
That's one of well, James said that everybody came from Mu and colonized the world, and that it was just Eastern or Western, whatever, which way they were going. And he hypothesized that it was the Maya, that they were the Maya that had done this. And to James, the Maya weren't the people we know as the Maya today. The Maya were the people that struck out from Mu and colonized the world. They were the navigators and shipbuilders and architects, and they built all the great structures all over.
Tell us how Augustus Le Plongeon, he fits into the Naacal tablets.
He only fits into the Naacal tablets because now I'm well aware from reading. My great grandfather has a biography. My Friend Churchy was the name of it. And it was written but never published. Gotcha. Actually, a version was published not too long ago. It was rewritten by the author's daughter, and it's markedly different than the original. But what I learned in there is that Le Plongeon and my great-grandfather would sit in the parlor with Alice Le Plongeon, and they would discuss politics and religion, and obviously they had quite a few discussions about lost continents and Le Plongeon's discoveries in Mexico itself. The only way that it really intersects is that Le Plongeon said that Mu was Atlantis. And for some strange reason, he placed Mu in the Atlantic Ocean and said it was Atlantis, although he wouldn't use the name, but he made it very clear that's what he was talking about. The word Naacal actually comes from, it's actually a Mayan word. It means learned one. And so that's the only interaction between the two of them. Le Plongeon's first Mu was in the Atlantic and was referring to Atlantis, and Churchward's Mu was in the other side of the world. But the Naacal is about the only thing that they have from each other. But he does include quite a bit of his material unattributed in his books.
Do you think, is there anybody else in your family tree then, Jack, researching this? You obviously are privileged to the biography diary of James and stuff like that and other artifacts from the family tree. Is there anybody else in the family tree researching this, Jack?
Negative.
Wow.
I'm the last one with the name, and like I said, growing up, we didn't have his books in the house. Everybody thought he was insane, or maybe a good showman, but definitely a kook.
What did you have to do? You must have had to, get a hold of the family tree and track everything down, being a family member.
I've just been lucky to be in the right place at the right time. The author's daughter, who used to work at the Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach, happened to find out that, she lived in Sarasota and I live in Clearwater, Florida, which is just a couple hours away. So I drove down and we visited, and she handed me a copy of the biography, and I handed her a copy of Books of the Golden Age that I had just obtained. That was a 1927 book that was published recently in the 90s.
What do you think about the tablets then, having looked at in your own engineering expertise, as they say, engineers always look at systems and they look at, all sorts of data and they analyze the research, the data. What do you think of the tablets so far from what you've seen? Niven's tablets, Naacal tablets, or both?
Well, I haven't seen any of the Naacal tablets, and I don't know anybody who has. That even includes the individual who wrote about it in an article. Mm-hmm. As far as the tablets found by William Niven, they're absolutely beautiful. Mm. I know they're weird looking, but they really had a drive, and they had a purpose to spend all that time cutting and painting, and to know exactly what they were talking about. That would be, what these symbols meant to them. That would be very helpful, because they'd put a lot of effort into it.
Wow. Okay, so we have the Mexican tablets, the Niven tablets, and we have Naacal tablets. How much can we extrapolate for the lost continent of Mu from these tablets, either from rubbings or descriptions of them? Is it a big reach to reach for the lost continent of Mu?
Well, on the basis of calling a large continent in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, I don't believe that what we've found in the last 80 years about geography allows a serious person to say that there was a continent that sunk. Sure. So we'd have to be looking at areas that were inundated at the end of the last ice age, whether it was, happened over a period of years or whether it happened over, I don't believe that the cataclysm he wrote about, sinking an entire continent in one day, that is probably not feasible. And that's, so we'd have to go looking someplace else to find out where exactly they could have had this ancient civilization, where they could have started everything and populated it. Mm-hmm. The new information about the Denisovians and about really doesn't aid in the Denisovian ancestry in our DNA, does not really call out that the out of Africa theory is complete and true.
Sure.
And especially since they've come up with it, there's another hominid that they have yet to identify as one of our relatives. What if the areas of most fertile civilization in Sundaland, down in Indonesia, and an area that was inundated after the last ice age, who says that the conditions there are such that we can't find the fossils because they're 100 or so feet or 1,000 feet underneath the sea.
Wow. Yeah, I think a lot of the Ice Age evidence, geological stuff, certainly fitting in with lost continents. I think maybe, sunken islands more so than anything. Rising sea levels, coastlines disappearing. We got a lot of sunken structures, and perhaps.
Well, there's the whole area of Doggerland up
Doggerland, yes,
in the North Sea.
Correct, yeah, in the North Sea there. I mean, that was like a hole. That may have joined Britain with Holland and up around there.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, what about Mu as a location to the east of Australia, out that direction? Geologically.
Well, that was the original thought of the southern continent that all the early paleoanthropologists were looking at to describe and account for the different distributions of the fossils that they were finding back in the late 19th century. And it was the great southern continent, and eventually it was, I believe, Mr. Schlachter that called it Lemuria after some of the fossils he'd found. But what's little known or little looked at is that he also believed that rather than just being in the southern Indian Ocean, it also went over towards South America. So as far as the beginnings of Lemuria just being an Indian Ocean continent, that's what I always thought too. But actually, his continent, he surmises, went all the way over to the Atlantic, across the Pacific too. I mean, they believed in a very large southern continent, and unfortunately for their theories, the plate tectonics took over, and we have a different understanding of that the continents ride on top of the plates, and the plates are mashing together some places. And
don't we have Don't we have historical accounts from the Mexican, Central American civilizations that they came from another place, and that they're stroke mythologies, if you want to call them? And when we don't understand history, we call it mythology, but they're historical accounts or stroke mythologies. Don't they speak of coming from the seas and a sunken landmass?
Well, I believe the Aztec believed it came from the north, and they were supposed to find the one place where the cactus and the eagle and the whatnot on the lake, and they came to Tenochtitlan.
Yeah, that's how they founded their city, when they seen the snake drop.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, you know, I'm looking at these tablets, Jack, and they're incredibly fascinating to look at. They look incredibly detailed and incredibly beautiful, and incredibly important. Why has nobody else took this on? Why has nobody else tried to research this?
Well, I believe that it is all due to the reputation of my great-grandfather, in that he was one of the few individuals that actually tried to interpret them, and he used them extensively in his later books. Well, he did it in the Children of Mu and the Sacred Symbols of Mu, and the second edition of the Lost Continent of Mu. He included them quite prominently. In fact, they almost take the place of the Naacal tablets that he wrote about in his 1926 book.
Wow. This looks incredibly important book, Jack. Tell us where people can get your website and whether we can get a copy of the book, Jack.
Well, my website is jack.churchward.com.
Do you think your engineering expertise is going to help you do some of this research as a systems approach?
Well, it's going to help me put it on the internet. That's one thing that's been of help. But as far as analyzing data, I haven't.
More of an archiving process, Jack, in terms of an archive.
Oh, I'm working on one. It's not fully up and running, but I do have a good one started, I think.
Sure.
what I eventually want to do is to write a biography of my great-grandfather.
Wow. Beautiful. Beautiful. He sounds like an incredibly interesting man, Jack. An incredibly interesting man.
He had definitely had a full and eventful life.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, just to even emigrate and go from one civilization, one country to another, I mean, at that time was an incredibly big change of the scenery, and then to get involved with the tablets when he was there, and to go around the world and such. Tell me about you. Are you considered wackadoo for taking up what your great grandfather has done today by the family? Do they think you're just crazy now as well, or?
I have yet to hear that. Well, they haven't said it to my face.
You won't know that. You'll be the last to know.
But actually, you can look at any of my materials on my website or in my books, and I stand by everything that I've written down. I'm not saying anything I don't believe is truthful, and if that makes me crazy, then guess I'm crazy.
Sure.
But
I think what you're trying to do is get this archive together, look at all this symbology, because it's important. It employs an ancient wisdom and it employs an ancient knowledge. And I like the way you're doing it, because you're not just throwing anything onto it. I think you're just trying to do it in a systematic, true sense, and not just put in what you think will sell. I mean, you're just trying to document this whole story properly, Jack. Would that be fair to say?
Well, I want to get the information out there and let people see them. Mm-hmm. And then, like I said earlier, I'd really like it that if some of any knowledgeable, serious, individual to take it upon themselves to, interpret what they mean. I mean, for instance, if this certain symbol here or there, they've seen it before, it forms part of maybe a Mayan glyph, or maybe it was used to decorate pottery, throw it up there. Fill out expand our knowledge on this.
Sure. Yeah, like I said, with the megalithic symbol, I definitely think it's incredibly unique, specific symbol, and I think, that these guys, the megalithic builders of Western Europe, I keep saying this time and time again, Jack, that these guys came from the sea. We have mythological tales and historical accounts that these guys came from the west. Now, when you look west of Ireland, all you have is the Atlantic. So, they weren't the Celts like most people think. The Celts inherited the megalithic civilization, and that these guys were already there, and that they came from the west. And
they have discovered over down here in Florida. You perhaps heard about it, the Windover Bog site, where they found some 8,000-year-old bodies, and they took the DNA, and it doesn't match any of the people from
America. Yeah,
from America. It might be probably linked back to Europe, but I don't believe that. That to me, that's not the amazing part.
Sure.
The amazing part was that they had an individual, a teenager, with spina bifida, buried. Now, even 50 years ago, if a child came out with spina bifida, they'd probably cull it.
Yeah.
And, which is absolutely amazing to me, that 8,000 years ago, they had the wherewithal to take care of this child,
they took care
keep him safe. And somebody didn't have to, they had enough extra time on their hands. They had enough protection. This is just one of the things that makes me think that maybe there is something about an ancient civilization out there that could do things that my great-grandfather thought were amazing, but that today we would understand that, they had a high level if they had a high level of society. But these folks didn't have to spend all their energies feeding themselves and protecting themselves. They had extra time to do things, which that's what I found to be amazing about that discovery.
You describe yourself as a Tibetan Buddhist. Can you tell me what a Tibetan Buddhist is for the non-educated person like myself, Jack?
I'm a follower of the teachings of the Drikung Kaibgang, who is there's a long lineage of mind-to-mind teachings called the Kaigyu. And one of the schools of the Kaigyu is the Drikung Kaigyu, and I try to call myself a member, not a good member, but a member of the Drikung Kaigyu. And we meditate and try to be nice people.
No, that's not a bad philosophy at all, Jack, for sure. Jack, we're at the end of the show. The book is called The Stone Tablets of Mu by Jack E. Churchward. And the other book that we've done the last time, as I said, just to give that a mention again, is Lifting the Veil on the Lost Continent of Mu, the Motherland of Men, again by Jack Churchward. Jack, it's fascinating talking to you again. It really has. I thank you for what you do, and I really do, because I think this is ancient wisdom, and I don't think this story has been archived or documented, and I don't think there's many people in a position to do so, and I think you are, Jack. I think you're one of the few that is in a position to do this, and it's great that you have access to the biographies from your great-grandfather and to put more emphasis on this whole story. And I think that, you know, some of this art and symbology in this book is incredibly interesting, incredibly important, and you know, let's see what comes out of this. I think we could have some interesting, I know for myself, just on symbology, because I look into symbology mostly over this side of the world, and you know, you throw out a picture of a symbol on Facebook or something like that, and somebody recognizes and goes, oh, that's the same as a petroglyph over here in America. And it may actually mean some philosophical meaning to ancient cultures, and there may be a link. So let's see what becomes of this.
Well, thank you very much for having me on and talking about this subject. And yes, I really do hope that people get involved and add their comments to the repository, so we get more information out there, and each of us can understand it better.
Oh, for sure. Again, Ozark Mountain Publishing, we can get copies of the books, both that I mentioned. And again, just give us your website before we go, Jack.
It's jack.churchward.com, jack.churchward.com.
Wonderful. I thank you for your time today, Jack, and talk to you in the not too distant future.
Thought and his works.
Sure. Yeah. I actually lived where he was born in Okehampton in Devon. I lived all around Cornwall and Devon in the UK, and Okehampton was one of the places I lived in. It's a lovely part of the world. So James basically came from Britain to America, and started a family there, and
actually he departed England after he got married in 1871, I believe, or 1870, and they moved to his wife's tea plantations in Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it was called at the time. And he was a tea planter in Sri Lanka. And that's what I have evidence for.
Sure. He had a connection with people in Sri Lanka as well, with the Tales of Mu.
Well, he did include one giant plate in one of his books was actually the Garden of Eden, and then the people from there went around the world to colonize, and that is essentially where our civilization has come from, and eventually the island sunk. And the current work that I'm here to talk about is the Stone Tablets of Mu, and it was it actually is wrapped around, like my previous book was wrapped around the Lost Continent of Mu, Motherland of Men. This book is wrapped around a completely unknown and unseen book for the past 80 years, the copies of stone tablets found by William Niven in Santiago Ahuizacla near Mexico City.
Thank you for the pronunciation, Jack. It's a tough one, isn't it?
I've had a little practice. And so James took this and presented it to his publisher, and it has remained in the University of California, Berkeley, I believe, library in a special collection, and it hasn't been seen. And I was lucky enough to obtain a copy of a PDF copy, and from there I wanted to make it available so that everybody could see it. And essentially the book covers the stone tablets specifically, the 38 or so that are contained in James' work. Mm. But there were in total some 2,600 of these tablets, and James used quite a few of them in his subsequent works.
Mm-hmm. Just to focus on James for a second and tie it in with your own engineering, you come from a generation of engineers, and James himself was an engineer. He was a patented inventor, an engineer, and an expert fisherman as well. And he even had a patent for an armored plated steel that was for protect ships during World War I. So this guy was no fool, Jack. This guy was a pretty clever guy.
Absolutely. He also had patents on railroad ties and different things for railroads as well.
Was he respected in his day for the work he was doing?
I would have to say no.
Did anybody get
circles,
it? Did anybody get it, Jack? Did anybody get it, or was it largely shunned?
Well, there were people that got it and have continued on with his thinking, the major part of being that, the major part of which is not whether or not there's lost continents, but whether or not we can bring ourselves back to a period where we all got along and didn't fight. Mm. You know, we were better people, I think, back then. Mm. Or at least that's the thing I get from James' thought.
Premise for this book that you have wrote, The Stone Tablets of Mu?
Well, my first book, you mentioned it, Lifting the Veil on the Lost Continent of Mu, Motherland of Men, was a culmination of research that I had engaged because from an early age I've taken the view, and my family has passed down the view, that my great-grandfathers were all a bunch of hooey. And his theories are that there was a Pacific Ocean continent which